Maybe I should start with wealth inequality. Do you not see a totally unfettered free market as increasing wealth inequality to an inordinate degree, or is this something that you just accept?
No, I can't predict whether it might increase it, it might decrease it. That, wealth inequality in our society, a lot of it is driven by government programs, that you have, restrictions for entry to various professions, which push up the wages of the people doing those professions. You have one of the sort of striking facts that nobody seems to realize. If you look at a graph of poverty rate in the U.S., starting basically at the end of World War II, which is where we have the data, from the end of World War II to about the point when the war on poverty got fully funded and manned, poverty rate is falling fairly sharply. From then on, it's been roughly constant. Roughly. I mean, obviously it goes up and down with economic conditions, but the theory of the war on poverty was that it was going to make people no longer poor, that it was going to get people permanently out of poverty. And it was entirely unable to do that in the various ways it tried. And what it ended up doing instead was making poverty somewhat less unpleasant by giving people money and things of that sort. And that's where it stayed. So my guess is that if you had a free market, you would have many fewer restrictions on people making money, including poor people. That, for example, there's no particular reason why being a barber should require a license. And yet in, I think, most cities it does. And the license requires things like 200 hours of classes on cutting hair. Well, being a barber is the sort of thing that a poor person who's reasonably competent can do. But it's illegal. And there are lots of other things in which that's the case. The only organization I actually normally donate money to is the Institute for Justice. And one of the things they do is to sue to knock down restrictions of that sort. But they have not knocked down anything like all of them. So there are various ways in which the government keeps people poor and makes people rich. There are various ways in which government keeps people from being rich. So I really can't predict whether you would end up with more or less income inequality. But I don't really regard income inequality as a bad thing. I regard poverty as a bad thing. But if the change is that the poor get 10% richer and the rich get 50% richer, that's a net gain, not a net loss.
So adopting anarcho-capitalism entails accepting that some people may, and I stress this, you don't want to predict, but I'll stress this word may, end up totally poor, homeless, healthy, and uneducated.
I'm not sure if you've noticed, but people do end up, quite a lot of people in our present society end up poor, uneducated, and homeless.
That's true.
The number of homeless, the homeless is to a significant degree a government creation because of the fact that very cheap housing is illegal. If you read Orwell, for example, on Down and Out in London and Paris, or Paris and London, I'm not sure how he orders it, he describes how very poor people lived in London when he was a pretty poor person. And it was basically in buildings where you had multiple people per room sleeping. Those would be illegal in probably any state, any city in the U.S. And they were cheap. Some of them were charitable. Some of them were, I think he actually said that he thought that he enjoyed the ones that were not charitable better than the ones that were charitable, because the ones that were charitable were religious and were trying to reform you as well as to house you. And there are all sorts of restrictions on housing construction in the U.S. at present. So I think that you would have almost certainly less homelessness. You would have the people who are now homeless. Well, some of them are homeless because they're crazy people who couldn't manage a home anyway. But the people who are homeless because they cannot afford a roof over their heads would have homes, but they would be very poor homes. They would be, look, in the Soviet Union under Stalin, in Moscow, you had people living a family to a room. That's a home. It's a very cheap home. And you would have something like that at the very low end. That problem, but you would certainly have poor people, and you will surely have uneducated people, but then we do now. And you would have rich people, and we have that now as well.
But in the current case, there are nonetheless, I mean, government-funded shelters and support. And I'm asking if anarcho-capitalism accepts that there could be people like this, homeless and unhealthy, without any supports, if there are not enough people with the necessary funding willing to support them.
Correct. That is, I think that if my guess is that a rich society, you will that there is enough emotional feeling about people not starving that I think, and food is pretty cheap, that in the kind of society I imagine, I think it is very unlikely that anybody would be starving because they couldn't get any food, because there would be people who thought, wouldn't it be neat, our church or our club or something will. I mean, it happens at the present. My wife's every a month or two, my wife bakes a whole bunch of bread for a project for the homeless that's run by local churches. And that doesn't depend on the government. And I expect that would still happen, probably happen more if the government weren't purportedly solving the problem. But it's certainly logically possible. I mean, it is logically possible that if you have no government, that some people will starve to death. It is logically possible that if you have a government, some people will starve to death. As it happens, all of the cases we know of large numbers of people starving with were places with very strong governments, right? I mean, we have three of them. Soviet Union, where Holodomor starved a couple of million Ukrainians to death. This may be one reason why Ukraine is not really fond of being Russian. You have China, where the Great Leap Forward, current estimates are about 30 million people dying, although there's some dispute about that. And you have Cambodia, which holds the record for its percentage of the population, where I don't know what the total numbers are, but a very large number of people died. Those are all cases where the government was in charge of handling food. And you don't observe that in I guess the only case I can think of in the last couple of centuries within a basically capitalist system would be the Irish potato famine. And that was largely dealt with by Irish leaving Ireland and coming to America, which was a sensible thing to do under the circumstances. But that was a case where it wasn't because people were poor, it was because there had been a disease that wiped out a large part of the main food that the people relied on.
The two biggest problems that struck my mind, we already discussed, and those are global warming / pollution, and then total wealth inequality. But maybe it is worth bringing back the military into things, and not necessarily even the military, but humans are naturally hierarchical and power seeking. And I wonder if you don't think that in an anarchic world, groups like the mafia or the church or gangs would immediately attempt to consolidate powers, or maybe you just see this as another logical possibility, but not a pressing one.
Yeah, I don't see any particular reason to expect they would succeed in that. That after all, if you really want to do that sort of thing, the first thing you do is to bribe the police, and the judges. There's a book, The Last Testament of Lucky Luciano. Luciano was a major organized crime figure back a ways, and the book claims to have been told to a newspaper man by Luciano when he was in retirement in Italy. And I believe it, but you can't prove whether it's real. It could have been invented by the guy. But one of the bits that struck me was that at one point he's running a criminal firm, and there are a group of maybe 4 or 5 criminal firms, and they're all independent, except they have a pooled fund for buying judges, because that's something where there's an economy of scale. So the present system, the system that I advocate, if a rights enforcement agency or a court system is doing a bad job of protecting people's rights, then you would expect that those people will go to a different seller, and it will lose money, and therefore it has an incentive to try to make sure that people aren't taking bribes. There is no comparable mechanism in our system.